Humanity,
Yeah.
metacognition, like you're aware of your cognitive processes, you're aware of your thoughts, things like that. You're aware
Yeah.
of what you're aware of,
Yes.
maybe, um, to some extent. So, Mark Solms, and of course people like define this thing in different ways, and then they study it in different ways, right? Like some people define it as any kind of experience. Like if there's an experience of a thing, then that's a form of consciousness, which to me is kind of really difficult in the sense that like you can experience things but not necessarily be aware of the experience, right? And so again, different definitions may alter your approach to studying the thing. Mark Solms, he does kind of use the definition from Thomas Nagel's, which is about experience. But then he also kind of oscillates back and forth between this and talking about awareness, which to me seems like two things which are somewhat compatible, but they're distinct. But anyways, so it starts with a quote from his physicist, and it says, physicist Paul Davies, 2019, among life's many baffling properties, the phenomenon of consciousness leaves us as especially striking. Its origin is arguably the hardest problem facing science today, and the only one that remains almost impenetrable even after 2,500 years of deliberation. It is the number one problem of science, of existence even. And this, of course, is referring to, the informational gap. How does like objective information that we can see about reality maybe become subjective information that's experienced, right? How do you observe such a subjective thing, right? Like I can never look into your head and turn your mind's eye and actually see what you're seeing. I can only see brain activity. So maybe we can study it through proxies like gravity, and so in gravity we see its effects on other things. Maybe our proxy in modern day is how does consciousness affect the brain, or more so how does the brain relate to consciousness and produce it, or whatever. Solm's argument is essentially this. Little progress has been made because we've been looking at the wrong place. It suggests that the wrong place we've been looking is in the cerebral cortex, specifically the frontal lobe. And he's suggesting that the pinnacle or the ultimate source of consciousness is actually in the brainstem, the reticular formation. And of course, as animals and life has evolved over many millions of years, right, most things have a brainstem. And so the implication then is that he's suggesting that most things have emotions, most things have a consciousness, or at least most animals. So yes, he's suggesting we look at the reticular activation system. And in doing this, a shift from higher cognitions up here to more basic, more primitive cognitions may give us the answer of, where and what is consciousness. Okay, and he kind of explores his ideas with some clinical cases, which is always a great way to elaborate a theory, right? And explain it, in hard, concrete examples. But before we move on to our clinical cases, does anyone, I've mentioned the hard problem every single week. Does anyone remember what David Chalmers' hard problem of consciousness refers to? Because these are always the problems that everyone's trying to address, these guys. Does anyone remember the hard problem? Okay. I'm going to just say the hard problem in my own words, but then I'm going to read Chalmers' actual statement of the hard problem. So basically the hard problem is how, for one, does a physical system produce a seemingly or possibly actually immaterial consciousness? And two, why? Why would it ever do that? That's the hard problem. Okay. To state it in Chalmers' words, the easy problems are easy precisely because they concern the explanation of cognitive abilities and functions. To explain a cognitive function, we only need to specify a mechanism that can perform the function. The methods of cognitive science are well suited for this sort of explanation, and so are well suited for the easy problems of consciousness. By contrast, the hard problem is hard precisely because it is not a problem about the performance of functions. The problem persists even if the performance of all relevant functions are explained. What makes the hard problem hard and almost unique is that it goes beyond problems about the performance of functions. To see this, note that even if we explain the performance of all of the cognitive and behavioral functions in the vicinity of experience, there may still remain a further unanswered question. Why is the performance of these functions accompanied by an experience? A simple question of functions leave us without answer. Why doesn't all of this information processing go on in the dark, right? Perhaps like the information processing of a phone or a computer. And similarly, Mark Solms addresses, the hard problem as something which needs to be answered, and maybe like what is this? How do we bridge this gap between the subjective and the objective information? And he also talks about Mary the neuroscientist from Jackson's example, where Jackson is suggesting that if a brilliant neuroscientist, learned everything there was to objectively know about how the nervous system processes information and develops some sort of perception of color, whatever, would it mean anything that they were colorblind? And so imagine that this person studied everything the science there was to know about colored vision, and in fact knew everything there ever could be known objectively from a scientific approach about colored vision. Well, if that person was colorblind and then was suddenly gifted sight of color, and they saw red, are they learning something new? And of course, Jackson and his collaborates, they would say yes. They would say she's gaining something new. If anyone remembers from last week, Daniel Dennett would say perhaps not. In any case, this is also an important thing to address. Is it then immaterial? Solm suggests not. It's not immaterial. That is still kind of an illusion. And anyways, as I alluded to earlier, he's defining consciousness using Nagel's approach. It is something, if there is something, it is like to be the thing, right? So it's something, it's like to be it, right? Is there something it's like to be a phone? Does that mean anything? Can you actually experience that? Does the phone have an experience or systems within it? There's something it's like to be me, and I have experiences, and there's something it's like to be each one of you, presumably, because you each have experiences. Is it a meaningful thing to say there's something to be like a rock? Probably not. A lot of people would say no, because it's not a system, it doesn't interact with the world, there's no indication that it's experiencing. Okay, so his first clinical case, Solms, he talks about his own brother, as they were young, falls 3 stories and cracks his head, suffers a very intense brain bleed and nearly dies. And this is obviously a prime motivator in his life, and he comes to the realization and reflecting on this. It's like, how am I just the central nervous system? He sees all these changes emotionally and cognitively in his brother, and he's like, how is it that I can be boiled down to a brain and spinal cord? How is that possible? He realizes that we are ultimately subjective beings, and the most profound part of this is that it results out of a physical basis, right? It results out of the brain. And if the brain dies, we disappear. And that there's something profound to him about this. And he remarks his training in neuropsychology, studied very fundamental cognitive processing. If he asked supervisors, they said, don't ask that kind of question. How does the brain produce consciousness? How does this part of the brain produce consciousness? Don't ask it. It's not a scientific question, and it doesn't go anywhere. So he's got a quote here. So he quotes, "Neuropsychology, like classical neurology, aims to be entirely objective, and its great power, its advances, come from just this. But a living creature, and essentially a human being, is first and last active, a subject, not an object. It is precisely the subject, the living I, which is being excluded. Neuropsychology is admirable, but it excludes the psyche. It excludes the experiencing, acting, living I." That's not his own quote. He's quoting Oliver Sacks, another psychologist, neuropsychologist, or something like that. So again, the question is, does the phone or something like this have experience similar to us in its information processing? Some would say yes, some would say no. the ones who would say yes are called panpsychists. Someone out of the information integration theory line of theory would suggest, maybe systems within the phone have some kind of experience. And this is something which needs to be addressed. He talks about how we can perceive and learn unconsciously, right? And this is an important, very important line of research for the theories of consciousness, right? So if we can perceive things and learn unconsciously, like we can learn motor movements unconsciously, right? We can perceive things unconsciously, and he talks about a study where, you can put these goggles on people and you flash, stimuli, right? And I cited, I think last week, talking about Daniel Dennett, that in this paradigm, you can flash a random pattern of visual stimuli in one eye and then a face in the other. They're not going to see the face. Most of the times they will not see the face. But if there's an emotional expression on the face, these people's physiological arousal will match that. So if the face is very angry, it freaks the people out. They become more physiologically aroused and less comfortable. But if the face is maybe happy, they're showing less signs of that kind of arousal. Solm cites that he cites a study where they put the name, so they flash the faces, right? And the people don't consciously perceive the faces. They don't know they've seen the faces. But you can attach the word rapist to the face in the flashing, or some other positive name, some other positive word. And those that saw the word rapist next to the name don't like that face as much as people who didn't see it, right? They're significantly more likely to suggest that I don't like that face, or I like it less, or I actually dislike that face. So it's very important to address, right? Like, why is it that we have an experience associated with our perception and learning? Because these people are learning to not like the face, but they didn't consciously see it. They didn't consciously know they learned that. So why is it that some forms of information processing are accompanied by an internal experience and emotions, importantly? Sorry. Okay. Again, why is some information processing unconscious? And these are the profound reflections he's having regarding his brother's head injury. Now he wants to address global workspace theory, one of the top 3 neuroscientific, cognitive scientific approaches to consciousness. And he talks about how global workspace theory suggests that we integrate our information into the prefrontal cortex, and here it becomes conscious. That's where your identity exists. That's where you are as an experience, as a thing. And so he says, well, then wouldn't we expect, if the prefrontal cortex was damaged, especially if all of it was damaged, wouldn't we lose ourself? Wouldn't we lose our concept of self, our awareness of self? Wouldn't we lose experience? Evan, are you able to invite Fair? Can you unmute yourself, please?
Hey, no, I don't think so.
Did you send a Microsoft email?
She just said she set it up in her thing.
Okay, can you just re-email me Fair's email? And I'm just going to continue speaking.
To your student email?
Yeah. And so Solm says, well, if the prefrontal cortex was damaged, especially if all of it was damaged, right, it's a large area, what would happen? Well, he cites his own clinical case. So he himself comes across a patient who, through sepsis, who through stroke, who through failed brain surgeries, loses almost all of their prefrontal cortex, right? This is something that's unheard of, or at least mostly. It's very rare, right? And he says, okay, this person had basically remnants of Broca's or Wernicke's area, which is the speech processing area of the brain, or the primary speech processing area. So importantly, this person is able to verbally report their consciousness, okay? And so he describes his conversation with this patient. And so what he first starts with the patient is he says, patient W, it's pseudonym, right, to protect privacy. He says, my books say you're unconscious. And here's how his conversation goes with the patient, where he, tests whether or not the patient is conscious. He says, are you consciously aware of your thoughts? Patient W says, yes, of course I am. And he says, and then Solm says, in order to confirm that, I'm going to ask you to solve a problem that will require you to consciously picture a situation in your mind. Patient W, okay. Solm says, imagine that you have 2 dogs and 1 chicken. W, okay. Do you see them in your mind's eye? W, yes. Now tell me, how many legs do you see in total? W, 8. Solm says, 8. And then he's crestfallen. He feels as if this patient is not conscious. He's terrified that this patient has done it wrong in their head. They're maybe not conscious because, 2 dogs, that's 8 legs in total, plus the chicken, that's 10. And then patient W responds, I am aware, he responds that the dog ate the chicken and therefore there are 8 left. And so he makes a joke, and Solms is, feels as if he's stumbled across some serendipity, right? This is a great discovery. The prefrontal cortex is not the source of consciousness. His third example, he talks about another popular theory of where is the source of consciousness in the brain. Craig's insula, right? So the insula hypothesized to be the region of consciousness because it's the place where you get an integration of the information dealing with the interoceptive, right? So bodily processing, sensing the body and understanding the body, and the exteroceptive, so understanding as the external world relates to the body, right? So this way you can maintain balance or whatever, and motor coordination and a sense of self relative to the world. So Craig suggests that this is the area of consciousness, and Solm says, well, there has been similar clinical cases of people with damaged insulas, but yet still conscious. His fourth case, right, and again, he's battling this tradition of studying consciousness through the cortex by citing cases of patients who lose all or nearly all of their cortex, hydrocephaly patients. So these are patients who, like the fluid in the brain, they maybe get some inflammation, or fluid just builds up and basically can enlarge the whole brain and smush it against the skull and result in a lot of damage, whatever. And he cites a patient who loses their entire cortex, and importantly, language processing, yes, is in the cortex. So these kinds of patients are nonverbal, and they can have an IQ of 40, very low cognitive processing. But he suggests that these patients are still conscious, even with just their brainstem, importantly. And so he's citing a 3-year-old, and he's saying, well, they have extreme cognitive deficits, but these people show raw feelings, and this is so important for consciousness. He suggests it's paramount. They show a range of emotions or emotional expression that are appropriate to the context, right? So you show them a funny stimuli, they laugh. You show them a sad thing, maybe it's sad. Show them a scary thing, scared, right? And so clearly that there's something very important here. And so he suggests, well, then it's something to do with the brainstem. And now he talks about patients who have damage to the brainstem, particularly the reticular activating system. And he's citing a clinical case of a patient who had a stroke, and it resulted in atrophy, lesioning of the of part of the reticular activating system. The lesion, 2 millimeters cubed. What happened? This person completely lost consciousness. Lights out. That's it. There's nothing. There's no more consciousness. And he now goes on to talk about how, okay, this isn't a surprise. People know this. People know that the reticular activating system is very important for turning the lights on. And there's kind of an analogy where it's kind of like the cable to a TV. All right, so the reticular activating system is like the power cord. It's not the TV. It's not the experience itself, but the power cord. That's the standard belief. And he suggests that this is at least a prerequisite of consciousness. So if these patients with no cortex can still feel emotions, and so therefore a form of consciousness. So it's not just a power cord, but it's still capable of consciousness. Well, he suggests that if we stimulate that area of the brain, we should be able to alter the emotions, right? And so using technologies like transcranial magnetic stimulation, transcranial direct cortical stimulation, he cites that a couple converging lines of evidence with these kinds of stimulation and also stuff out of pharmacology. So first, if you stimulate this part of the reticular activating system, the substantia nigra, which is affected in Parkinson's patients, he says if you stimulate this, you so a researcher was treating a woman with Parkinson's, and he accidentally hit this area and stimulated it. And what he found was within like 5 seconds, this lady who had never experienced depression in her lifetime was suicidally depressed. Right? So she was like, why am I here? I don't want to live anymore. I'm such a bother to everyone. My life has been horrible. I want to cry in the corner. Like very, very intense negative emotion. Wants to kill herself. Says she doesn't want to live anymore. And then within 90 seconds after brain stimulation ceases, she also is no longer depressed. She's fine. He cites a later double-blind study which comes out of this, which is where a researcher, double-blind studies are if the researcher and the patient neither know which is being applied. And so this is very important to limit placebo effects, or to cancel out placebo effects. And so he's citing a double-blind study where the researcher doesn't know which part of the brain is being stimulated. They're either stimulating part of the cortex or the substantia nigra. And he says that, okay, in this study, what they found was that if you stimulate the substantia nigra, these people become, extremely sad. Whereas this is not the case with stimulating regions of the cortex. He cites PET studies, so a functional image which shows, parts of the brain where blood is flowing and therefore active parts of the brain. And he suggests that, yes, the reticular activation system is more active in extreme feelings of happiness, sadness, fear, anger. In extreme emotions, the reticular activating system is more active. It's processing more. Something's happening there. And lastly, he cites that in psychopharmacology, we use different drugs to treat emotional disorders. So he cites that SSRIs, targeting the serotonergic system. Well, serotonin comes from part of the reticular activation system. He suggests that antipsychotics targeting dopamine, also a product of the reticular activation system. And lastly, anxiolytics for anxiety sometimes can target noradrenaline, also from the reticular activation system. And so he's suggesting that, okay, emotional disorders are essentially related to this system. He's suggesting that extreme emotions are related to the system, right? So these are important facets of consciousness. And lastly, if you stimulate this area, extremely conscious in the sense that, getting extreme emotions. And lastly, patients with no cortex still have a sense of self, still responding with appropriate emotions to stimuli with this brainstem. And so he's suggesting that the reticular activation system is not only the power supply, but it is the source of consciousness. It is the most important part of the brain for determining who you are, right? So again, there's this idea that your identity, whoever you are, this continuity of experience is located in the brain. He's suggesting it's not the cortex, it's not the insula, it is the reticular activation system. And so he's suggesting, here's the answer to the heart problem. Why consciousness? So he's not offering a mechanism. He can say it can happen here in the RAS, but he doesn't know, how is this computationally happening? How is this physically possible? But he's at least offering a why, and his suggestion is, well, consciousness is just something which is necessary. It's a necessary product of emotional processing. You can't have emotions without consciousness. And so he's suggesting that consciousness is kind of just a thing which happens with emotions, and so therefore emotions are paramount to consciousness. And then it's like, well, why emotions? And the evolutionary answer is, well, one, emotions guide us towards maintaining homeostasis, right? So they allow us to typically approach things which are good for homeostasis and survival and reproduction, and avoid things which are bad for us. So we don't like the heat and we may feel emotional. We don't like pain and so we feel emotional and avoid the noxious stimuli, whatever. We may like certain foods and feel happy and, you know, approach that and eat it and whatever. And importantly, you know, he also talks that you cannot make a decision without an emotion. There needs to be a value system, and the emotions are what govern that value system, right? And so you make emotional decisions based on what you want or not, you know. I didn't see anything from him saying this, but, you know, I'm familiar with other lines of research where there's patients with kinds of brain damage that they don't feel emotions. These kinds of patients do not make decisions, right? So, you know, the clinician can ask, okay, would you like this date or this date for an answer? These people can take up to an hour to answer which date they prefer for no good reason. They cannot make a decision. They cannot decide things without an emotional value system guiding their decisions. Okay, so that's basically it. Consciousness is an emotional product, reticular activation system, not the cortex, and the evolutionary function guides the decision making and helps us maintain homeostasis, good for survival and reproduction. That's what he's suggesting. What do you guys think? Moise, can AI make decision unconsciously?
I don't think so. I mean, I would say no. I'm not an expert, but I would say no.
Yeah. Anyone else think you can make decisions unconsciously with no emotions?
First of all, I don't know how you associate consciousness with an AI.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what you mean.
Well, Tsunami suggests that anything which is a physical system, and then he has his requirements for what is a system. He said, and remember, this was back in my very first presentation. Tsunami is suggesting that anything which meets his requirements for what is a physical system, which is a thing that like bidirectionally interacts with the world. So it, you know, it's anything which has a bidirectional causal power, and every single part of it is interconnected. That's what he's suggesting. I don't know if that's like a scrambled eggs worth of words, if that makes any sense, but like that's what he's suggesting. It's a thing, you know, which basically influences itself, right, both ways, and has a bunch of different states, and it influences itself to express different states. And in expressing its different states, it is therefore experiencing something. Here's my problem with Solm's explanation, is that, well, why? Like, why do you need emotions to govern a value system, for one, right? So there's just something which doesn't satisfy me with the answer that like emotions are necessary for guiding decision making and survival. And like, sure, they can be, but are they absolutely necessary in all cases? Is that a universal truth? I don't believe that yet. And then my other problem is schizophrenic patients and sometimes other people with like certain forms of depression, whatever, bipolar disorder as well. There's these affective disorders where people become effectively flat. They don't feel emotions, but yet they are still conscious. They're experiencing. So they're not feeling emotions, but they're conscious. So that to me suggests that maybe emotions aren't actually paramount to consciousness. They're an important facet, but they're not everything. You can still have consciousness without that. I don't know anything about how the reticular activation system relates to these patients, flattening of affect, but you know, I'd be interested to look into it. There's an important thing I think should be addressed though with these patients. I believe that these patients who become affectively flat also do have a very difficult time doing anything. So they'll kind of just have no motivation to move, no motivation to do anything. So clearly, you know, motivation and decision making and action, emotion is important for it, at least in humans. Okay, that's everything I have to say.
Is there another presenter today?
No, that's everything.